Oh, hell, Internet. Time for another chapter from the book of Master Mo. The next section is called Moderation in Use, and only 2 of the 3 versions of it still exist to this day. They're both quite short, so I'm going to go through both, but I will try and keep my comments to a minimum so that we don't run too long here. So, Chapter 20, Moderation in Use 1. 20.1. When a sage governs a single state, that one state's benefits can be doubled. On a larger scale, when a sage governs the world's benefits can be doubled. His doubling of benefits does not come through acquiring land beyond the borders, but by doing away with useless expenditure in his own state. This is enough to double benefits. A sage who governs when he issues edicts and promotes affairs, when he employs the people and uses materials, does nothing that isn't useful. For this reason, the use of resources is without waste, the people are not overburdened, and the increase in benefit is considerable. Why does he make clothes and fur garments? To keep out the cold of winter and withstand the heat of summer. In general, the principle of making clothes is to provide warmth in winter and coolness in summer. What is merely decorative and doesn't add to these objectives, he eschews. Why does he make dwellings and houses? To keep out the wind and cold of winter, and withstand the heat and rain of summer, and to provide protection against thieves and robbers. What is merely ornamental and doesn't add to these objectives, he eschews. Why does he make armor and shields and the 5 weapons? To withstand plunder and disorder due to thieves and robbers. If there is plunder and disorder due to thieves and robbers, those who have armor and shields and the 5 weapons can overcome them, and those who don't can't. This is the reason a sage makes armor and shields and the 5 weapons. In general, in making armor and shields and the 5 weapons, it is beneficial to make them as light as possible, but they should be strong and hard to break. What is merely ornamental and doesn't add to these objectives, he eschews. Why does he make boats and carts? Carts are made to travel over hills and level ground, while boats are made to travel on rivers and waterways as ways of benefiting communication in the 4 directions. In general, in making boats and carts, it is beneficial to make them as light as possible. What is merely ornamental and doesn't add to this, he eschews. Overall, in making these things, if something does not add to use, it is not done. In this way, there is no wastage in the use of materials. The people are not overburdened, and the increase in benefit is considerable. So, we can see here Mo's perspective on governance. It's somewhat utilitarian. You might see it as something of a maximin strategy, that making the best possible use of resources means that the condition of everyone in the state is brought to the highest minimum level that it is possible to achieve. And this makes perfect sense. It's also an argument against bureaucratic waste, which will also come up again. In a way, it's again very idealistic. The existence of bureaucratic waste is impossible to avoid, but as an ideal, although it is somewhat extreme, somewhat austere, it is sensible, we can say, from a certain point of view. Moving on. 20.2. Again, if the great officer's love of accumulating pearls and jade, birds and animals, and dogs and horses is done away with in order to increase the numbers of clothes and garments, dwellings and houses, armor and shields, the 5 weapons, and boats and carts, the numbers can be doubled. If these are not difficult to double, what is it that is difficult to double? It is only the population that is difficult to double. Nevertheless, the population can be doubled. The sage kings of former times made a law stating, when men are 20 years old, they must marry and have a family. When women are 15 years old, they must take a husband. This was the law of the sage kings. But now the sage kings are no more, and the people have cast off restraint. Those who wish to get married and have a family early do so at 20, while those who wish to get married and have a family late do so at 40. In this way, the number of those marrying early is reduced by the number of those marrying late. with the result that the average is 10 years older than that decreed by the law of the sage kings. If a child is born every 3 years, in this period there would be the addition of 2 or 3 people, if you were following the law of the sage kings. So, is it possible to double the population without making people marry and have a family early? It is not. So, here we see the law of the sage kings that men should marry and have a family at 20 and women should take a husband at 15. The disparity there is obvious, and obviously we could look at this in the patriarchal context of almost all ancient cultures. And fair point, in the modern world this is absolutely not the best way of doing things. It is well known that the liberation of women and them taking control of their reproductive rights is associated with raising people out of poverty and raising the general level of education of children that are born in such a society. This is the way that modernity works. But it was not entirely true back then, and I think we can afford to give some license to people who may have seen the ways of the sage kings as being the best way of organizing the population of a state. In this time, the state was young, and the most valuable resource of a state was indeed its population who could work the land. As Mo says, no state is making productive use of all available land, and the reason for this is a lack of people. Also, women are the only individuals, the only humans who are able to create new members of a population. So if your primary concern is to increase this most valuable resource, there is a certain logic in saying, well, in that case, women should start having children early and they should attend to that more closely than they attend to any other task. And so there is a certain logic to the law of the sage kings, even if it isn't actually practical in the modern world. And of course, it is possible to envisage systems which could have started in the ancient world that would not have required these kinds of models. We might further ask if they are truly compatible with the way that human nature was working as we emerged from the state of nature and our early tribal times, but that is a larger discussion. 20.3 now. Nowadays, those who conduct government in the world have many ways of reducing the population. They cause the people to be burdened with labor, the taxes imposed are heavy, materials for the people are insufficient, so that those dying of cold and hunger cannot be counted. Moreover, great officers raise armies to attack neighboring states. Long campaigns last a whole year and short campaigns last several months. So for long periods, men and women don't see each other. In this way, the population is reduced. Those who are made sick by unsettled living conditions and irregular intake of food and drink, as well as those who are ambushed or injured by attacks by fire and killed in assaults on cities or battles on open ground, cannot be counted. Are these not several ways of reducing the population that have arisen through those who presently conduct government? Only when the sages governed was it not like this. When the sages governed, several ways of increasing the number of people also arose, did they not? Therefore, Master Mo said, doing away with useless expenditure was the way of the sage kings. It was the great benefit of the world. So, TLDR for this section, the sagacious will grow the state, the mediocre governors will reduce it. And there in 20.3, Mo does put blame for the reduction of the population, not just on the reproductive habits of the population, but also on those governing, the mediocre men who are too concerned with their own gains and political power, the growth of their lands at the expense of the people within those lands. And this, again, is a problem that persists to this day. Again, we might ask, is Mo overly idealistic in saying that it could be possible that it was done any other way? as I said before, I don't think the Sage Kings were inherently better governors. I think they had the benefit of being some of the first governors that the world had seen. And so the people afforded them a certain benefit of the doubt. But that is another discussion. Let's move on to Moderation in Use 2, chapter 21. 21.1. Master Mo spoke, saying, "In ancient times, the way enlightened kings and sages unified the world and corrected the feudal lords was through their loving the people with great devotion and benefiting the people very substantially. Devotion and trust are closely connected and are, moreover, made manifest by benefit. In doing this, throughout their lives, they were never satisfied and did not weary until they died. This was how, in ancient times, enlightened kings and sages unified the world and corrected the feudal lords." Interesting here, there is an indication, a suggestion that enlightened kings, whether it be the Son of Heaven or simply the rulers of individual states, had the principles of universal love for their people, and they made great pains to benefit the people directly. And interestingly, they mention correcting the feudal lords, suggesting that feudal lords never fully have this idea of universal love internalized, and only the sage kings, the enlightened rulers, truly do this. Again, it doesn't seem a particularly realistic situation to me. But it is interesting that universal love is connected with the trust of the people. Devotion and trust are closely connected. And on a slightly more cynical basis, we can see in the modern mass society the phenomenon of populism, political populism, not in the sense of actually giving people what they want, but in the sense of manipulating people to believe that those in power are giving them what they want, when actually giving them nothing at all, is how this principle of Mo's is perhaps not explicitly, but in fact being corrupted by the political actors of the modern mass society, tragically. 21.2. For this reason, the sage kings of ancient times, in establishing their rules for moderation in use, said, "Throughout the world, all the many artisans, wheelwrights and cart makers, tanners and salters, potters and metal workers, and carpenters should each do the work they are capable of. They also said, everywhere we should provide enough for the people's use and then stop. Anything over and above this is wasteful and doesn't add to the benefit of the people, so the sage kings didn't do them." This is, I guess you could say, the technically correct form of communism. Now, when I say technically correct, those who are familiar with that meme will know what I mean. Technically correct does not mean actually correct, and certainly does not mean the best. This is basically Mo saying that the sage kings should institute a planned economy. And a planned economy is one of the things that has certainly not functioned so far in any political context. It certainly didn't function in the 20th century, and it probably didn't function even in the smaller states of those times. Should we ever have a general intelligence, an artificial general intelligence that could see all of the variables in much greater precision than any human or set of humans ever could, things may change. However, what Mo is suggesting here is a planned economy of the kind suggested under 20th century communism. And for that reason, it would be doomed to fail. 21.3. In ancient times, the sage kings, in establishing their rules for drink and food, said, "Provide enough to fill what is empty and sustain the spirit. Give strength to the limbs and make the ears and eyes sharp and keen. Then stop. Do not go to great lengths to blend the 5 flavors, sweet, sour, bitter, pungent, and salt, or to harmonize the various aromas, and do not look to distant lands for things that are rare, strange, and different." How do I know this was so? In ancient times, when Yao brought order to the world, in the south he brought peace to Jiaozhi. In the north he established the boundaries of Youdu. In the east and west he reached to where the sun rises and sets. and there was nowhere that did not submit to his rule. When it came to what he accepted and received, it was not 2 kinds of grain or large pieces of meat. He ate from a simple bowl, drank from a simple cup, and took wine from a ladle. As for the ceremonial forms of bowing and walking and deportment, the sage kings did not practice them. So again, Mo is suggesting that overly elaborate things, including in the likes of food and drink, are wasteful and not productive to the state. He also mentions how the sage king comported themselves in a very simple way. I think there's a bit of a tension here. When we find new flavors, when we find new ways of creating foods, food does more than simply sustain the body. Food is an experience which allows us to appreciate variety in very simple terms. When you are eating something, you might eat until you are full, but if then someone brings out something else which looks delicious, then you are going to try it. There is an evolutionary reason for this, because you might see that an interesting food looking different from things that you have tried before might contain new vitamins, new minerals, new substances which can add to your health and well-being. And furthermore, new flavors which can enrich your appreciation for the variety. Variety, after all, is the spice of life. So when Mo counsels against finding these rich and elaborate foods or creating new flavors and aromas, I think he goes too far in his austerity. But when he says that the rulers of the state should not overly concern themselves with these great riches and these elaborate feasts and bowing and scraping rituals, there I think we can say he is right on the money. It is the fixation of the rulers on their own carnal desires and on being treated with what they regard as due deference that has led to human nature in politics running amok and creating this twisted system that we have seen since Mo's time and continue to see to this day. Moving on. 21.4. In ancient times, the sage kings, in establishing their rules for clothes and garments, said, "In winter, make clothes that are purple or brown in colour, and light as well as warm. In summer, make clothes of fine and coarse linen that are light as well as cool. Then stop. Anything over and above this is wasteful and doesn't add to the benefit of the people. So the sage kings did not do them." 21.5. In ancient times, because the people were being injured and harmed by fierce and cunning animals, the sage kings taught them to carry weapons when they went out and about, saying they should wear a sword that pierced when used for stabbing and cut when used for striking. When armor is worn, it should be light and convenient and allow ease of movement. These are the benefits of armor. Carts are for the purpose of carrying heavy things over a distance. When mounted, they should be safe. When drawn, they should be convenient. Safe insofar as they don't injure people, and convenient insofar as they reach their destination quickly. These are the benefits of carts. In ancient times, because there were great rivers and wide ravines which could not be crossed, the sage kings devised boats and oars which served their purpose, but nothing more. Even if those above, such as one of the 3 dukes or a feudal lord, came, the boats and oars did not change, and the boatmen did not decorate them. These are the benefits of boats. So this is fairly mundane advice, and it simply gets again to the idea that whatever you're doing, whatever functional trappings of civilization you are creating, unnecessary ornamentation is not beneficial to the state. It does not provide function, and so it should not be done. Now, again, we could say the austerity goes a little too far here, and there is evidence that even going back to caveman times, cavemen forging their very first stone tools tried their best to make them symmetrical because of the aesthetic qualities that this seemed to imbue. There was no need for a simple stone axe to be symmetrical, but it seems apparent that the Stone Age people went to great lengths to make them so because of this sense of beauty. And this is something that Moe definitely overlooks when he's making his very austere proclamations. That being said, I don't think that we should cast off all of what he says here. Clearly, there is an extent to which, especially those in the ruling positions, overdo the sense of need for elaborate ornamentation in their products. 21.6. In ancient times, the sage kings established their rules for moderation in funerals, saying, the burial garments should be of 3 kinds, sufficient for decaying flesh. The coffin should be 3 kun thick, sufficient for decaying bones. The hole for the grave should be not so deep as to reach water, but deep enough for the stench not to escape, and that is all. Once the dead are buried, the living should not mourn for a long period. This will come up again in our next section. But finally, 21.7. Ancient times, when people first came into being, were times where there were no buildings and houses, so they relied on digging out holes in mounds and hills and living in them. The sage kings, in their contemplations, thought about this digging out and said, during winter, it would be possible to avoid the wind and rain in this way, but when summer comes, there would be dampness and moisture below, and steam and vapor above. They feared this would harm people's spirits, and therefore they created buildings and houses that were beneficial. So then, what were their rules for making buildings and houses? Master Moe spoke, saying, what is at the sides should be able to keep out wind and cold. What is above should be able to keep out snow, frost, rain, and dew. What is within should be clean and pure, so that it can be used for prayers and offerings. The inner walls of the building should be adequate to maintain the proper separation between men and women. That is all. Anything over and above this is wasteful and doesn't add to the benefit of the people. So the sage kings did not do them. So in this section, I think Moe is fixating rather on a time when society was unable, the state particularly, was unable to create efficiency through scale. And so the individual people had to be more frugal in order to create the most efficient state it was possible to create at that time. This is certainly not true now, and I don't think it was even really true in Moe's time. I think he overstates the austerity which was necessary to create a functioning state. Humans seek satisfaction. Satisfaction can come through efficiency. There is a certain satisfaction in knowing that something is done in the most efficient way possible. But satisfaction also comes through novelty. And the novelty of creating new forms is definitely something that Moe overlooks. If one never tries to create boats and carts or the 5 weapons and so on in a new way, then one might miss the possible benefit of innovation. Of course, excessive ornamentation in things that do not require it is a waste of effort and resources. But as the states have grown and people have been able to become more focused on being artisans and artists in the longer term, perhaps even that can be looked at as being beneficial in its own way. I think the food example works best. The idea that Moe says we should not be overly concerned with trying to find new flavors and aromas and combining them in new and interesting ways. Well, in that case, what is the joy that can be got from eating at all? Perhaps for Moe, there was no such joy, but I think most people generally will consider that in eating, they like to have new experiences, and it is something that is satisfying. But anyway, that is my take on moderation in use from the book of Master Moe. Let me know what you think. Please put in the comments down below. If you happen to be familiar with the book of Moe, then please give me your perspective. But even if not, please tell me what you think. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.